Your show will go live in 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Love Talk Radio.
Divine all blessed greetings and salutations, one and all. You are now experiencing another revolutionary Hoodoo New Orleans Voodoo secrets and recipes with the Divine Prince. Divine all blessed peace and love, joy and prosperity elevation, revelations, and manifestation. You are now listening live to the Divine Prince, Pan-African Spiritualist, Practitioner, Author, and Advisor, Elagun Oloye, Hoodoo, Obeah, Bokor, sharing with you in all things spiritual, mystical, metaphysical, cosmic, universal, evolutionary, revolutionary, healing, and holistic from a Pan-African Hoodoo world spiritualist perspective, understanding that all is indeed a blessing. If you can just see beyond the veils, for it is all just an illusion and a test, and one of the greatest divine mysteries of this life cycle. This is indeed my constant prayer, my mantra, affirmation, reverberation, my reiteration, and it is my ever living reality. It is crucial to the very foundation of my inner standing, my teaching, my walk, my works along this divine, all blessed life path and journey. It is how I, the Divine Prince, make sense out of all that we are challenged with here in our daily existence on Mother, Father, Earth. And it is my personal place of power and understanding, the place from where I begin, the place from where I crystallize and realize all my endeavors, understanding that I and I alone create and co-create my divine destiny. And I alone create and co-create my divine, all blessed reality. And so it is. Ashe, Asheo, and Ashe. This Monday, May 20th, 2024, Ki Ojo Day, and I am emanating and vibrating with you and for you live, virtually, verbally, cosmically, quantum universally from this working temple of the House of the Divine Prince. Thai Potions, Hoodoo Central, in this legendary, historic, beautiful, and most enchanted city in America, New Orleans, Louisiana, the land of my ancestors and those who came before me along this spiritualist Hoodoo Obeah life path and journey, passing down the great Obeah stick, along with the knowledge of the life-giving herbs, roots, plants, rituals, spirits, and minerals. I'm always honored, humbled, appreciative of the time that we spend in sacred space at high noon U.S. Central Standard Time here on Blog Talk Radio and all social media platforms by which I can be reached by way of StreamYard. So thank you, Facebook, Twitter, my EarthCam page, the others who are now listening to me in LinkedIn. Certainly I'm grateful and appreciative of you for being active listeners and participants in the show, where we share the legacy, the culture and tradition, the history, and certainly our sacred stories, We've been talking, for the last maybe 2 weeks now about the footprint, the presence of conjure, root work, hoodoo, voodoo, magic, if you will, in revolutionary acts, not just in living and surviving from day to day, but also in revolutionary acts. And we have understood this to not only be an extension of our own community, but we've documented that similar footprint in politics, in religion, in governments, certainly in governments. So we are going to continue our discussion today. I certainly invite you to participate, to gear up your webcams if you indeed wish to come on live. You can also call me always to listen in and call in by way of Blog Talk Radio, area code 563. I believe that's toll free, 563 999 3763. 563 999 3763. And I'm eternally grateful for Blog Talk Radio as a platform and my international listening audience. I started doing daily podcasting here on Blog Talk Radio first and sort of expanded into StreamYard, YouTube, and other various platforms. But my base is in Blog Talk Radio. My largest numbers and listening audience is in my international Blog Talk Radio reach. So I'm certainly grateful to all of us in the Northern Hemisphere that listen and support the show. But I'm even more in gratitude for those south of the hemisphere, south of the equator, Brazil, Peru, Chile, Australia, New Zealand, India, Pakistan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Libya, Nigeria, Ghana, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, United Republic of Tanzania, Zambia, and South Africa. I'm certainly grateful for your listenership and your continued support of the show and keeping my numbers high for me here in Blog Talk Radio, even when I'm not always available to broadcast live. So we're going to talk, as I promised in previous podcasts, about the presence of African conjurers in day-to-day resistance. I opened up this series of discussions asking the question, why aren't more of us, particularly now where ATR, traditional African-based religious systems, Pan-African spirituality and tradition, certainly Aboriginal, indigenous spirituality and tradition has gained great popularity in the world. We owe a great deal of that to the World Wide Web, the information superhighway, as it was once called, the internet, and certainly social media, Instagram, TikTok, for bringing popularity to the traditions, interest to the traditions, and certainly in all things, there's that binary coded activity, the light and the darkness. Certainly, we constantly have to educate, re-educate, first ourselves, but then the greater community about what voodoo is and is not, what magic is and is not, what indigenous Aboriginal practice and tradition is and is not. We understand, many of us, that during the time of enslavement on this side of the Middle Passage, the dreadful, horrific genocide of our people, for more than half of the people relocated, died before they reached these shores. But those that managed to survive maintain the coding, the math, the rhythm of our traditions in their blood. We understand ancestral memory to be encoded within the very blood, the very DNA chain within our body cells. This is not just some voodoo philosophy, but we now understand it to be biology. We understand it to be archaeology. We understand it to be science. That ancestral memory survives in the blood. And I've been saying for years that if we could count in Airway, in Fan, in Akan, in Twi, in Igbo, in Hausa, we're just being forced now to learn to count in Portuguese, Spanish, French, and certainly anglicized language, English. So we never lost a connection to the Creator. We never lost a connection to our great ancestors. We never lost our connection to nature. And certainly voodoo is nature. First and foremost, voodoo is nature, and it is innate and inherent within nature. When we speak of traditions in the Aboriginal and Indigenous world, where we understood the presence of spirit in all things material. We understood that it was certainly given titles, labels, names by the colonists and the colonizers and the explorers, so-called explorers that encountered our arts and our sciences. But we understood the presence of God, if you will, the presence of spirit in all things. So, in an environment where we're not given adequate food, adequate diet, adequate health care, adequate nurturing and care, we indeed found that in the new world within ourselves, within each other, and certainly within nature. The practice of healing, both Massa's house and the enslaved population, was commonplace, well documented commonplace. But certainly we can understand now that there were other practices of protection, defense, divination, retribution that were also enacted that have not been given quite as much coverage until maybe the last few years with the invent of TikTok and promoters within that space who are sharing information as they uncover and recover and discover information. It is indeed reshared back into that space. A well documented arena for activity of conjure, magic, hoodoo, root work, voodoo with four O's, voodoo with the U's, however you choose to spell it, whatever language you are speaking it in. We have a strong footprint of resistance. So, aside from their obvious presence in the trial records of slave revolts and conspiracies, conjurers also make their appearance in a number of slave narratives, interviews, biographies, and autobiographies as agents in day to day forms of resistance. I am using a new microphone in Blog Talk Radio. So, anyone in Blog Talk Radio, please send me a chat or shoot me an email or an instant message and let me know the audio quality in Blog Talk Radio. Let me know that I'm being heard and I'm being heard with clarity. And so, through these sources, there is ample proof that conjurers were an ever present factor in the lives of the majority of North American slaves. So, when we hear the erroneous retelling that there was no revolting, we hear the erroneous retelling that we didn't have maroon culture. We now have very well documented maroon culture and maroon camp documented culture right here in New Orleans and the surrounding areas of New Orleans. But we have much more documented in Central America, South America, certainly Nanny of the Maroons, and many others. Our front line of defense were our ancestors and continue to be our ancestors. And through these sources, we've gathered ample validation that conjurers were present in every aspect of North American enslaved life. No less an authority than William Wells Brown once noted that nearly every large plantation had at least one who claimed to be a fortune teller, in his words, who was regarded with more than common respect by his fellow slaves. Speaking on the widespread appeal of conjuration in South Carolina in the early 1800s, Charles Ball added that enslaved Africans are universally subject to the grossest and most abject superstition and uniformly believe in witchcraft, conjuration, and the agency of evil spirits in the affairs of human life. Many of us have heard the telling that until the lions have their own authors, can write their own books, the stories will always be slanted towards the hunter. And so, as I've said in many other podcasts, when we are examining, researching, discovering these documents, always keep in mind the author, in this case, William Bells Brown, and their overlay of white supremacist ideology and linguistics in the telling and retelling of our story. Combined, these statements demonstrate that not only were magical practitioners ubiquitous, but belief in their supernatural abilities encompassed a large portion of the slave populace. And we say the slave populace as if they did not have day to day contact with the overseers, the majority, uh, the slave owners, the so called majority populace, certainly the free blacks and the free blacks who indeed owned their families or owned slaves. So everyone had an eye in and ear in some idea, some fantasy, some dream, some nightmare, some retelling of what we were doing and what we were acting in and how we were dealing with our own day-to-day existence through the use of ATR. We indeed have a footprint of Frederick Douglass. A conjurer named Sandy Jenkins was employed for Frederick Douglass of Easton, Maryland, created a shaping impression of his early life. After a savage beating he received at the hands of Edward Covey, a man who enjoyed the reputation of being a first rate hand at breaking young slaves, Frederick Douglass eventually turned to Sandy Jenkins for assistance. In Douglass' words, Sandy was not only a religious man, but he professed to believe in a system for which he had no name. He gave a genuine African He was a genuine African and had inherited some of the so called magical powers, according to Frederick Douglass, said to be possessed by African and Eastern nations. So we know it was common knowledge. We now understand Frederick Douglass to ultimately become a well educated man and writer himself. And so, in a scientific parameter, I trust the words of Frederick Douglass. I don't necessarily sense the same. Um, it's present there, but he didn't even know what the system was called. But he certainly wasn't using the same language that William Wells Brown and others use when speaking of um, black magic, for lack of better words, as witchcraft, conjuration, and the devil's work, if you will. Sandy instructed Douglas to find the root of an herb in the forest that had mystical powers of protection. After undisclosed preparations, Sandy further instructed Frederick Douglass to wear the root on his right side because it would be impossible for Covey to strike a blow, that with this root, no white man could whip him. Now, to Douglas, talk of magically endowed herbs and roots was very absurd and ridiculous, if not potentially sinful. Um, Again, many of our people were still operating in the traditions and tenets of Islam that they came to America with, quite possibly converted to in private with other enslaved populace. But certainly a larger portion was beginning to buy into the new witchcraft, which was Christianity, which we now understand was a tool used against us, um, and then ultimately used to control us. These statements were guided in part by Frederick Douglass' acceptance of Christianity and can also be viewed as an appeal to both his writing audience and the fellow abolitionists. I remember my earlier days um, in voodoo, in my teens, in my 20s, and even up until, Hurricane Katrina and my introduction to social media. I tried to use softer words. Um, Being a, former evangelical Christian, I speak the language. I know the book. Um, I have a good parent and a bad parent who both claim evangelical Christianity. I know it better than many of you who are listening on the sound of my voice who claim to possess it. Okay. So in my early years, I attempted to soften the words, be more diplomatic, absolutely, avoid fear triggers. For many people have fear triggers in association with the tradition. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today and in shows to come. So I was trying to, appease the Christian or religious ear, and certainly the bastardized ear that had been misinformed by movies, literary works, um, creative license in terms of entertainment about what voodoo was. And so I can relate, I can empathize to some degree and sympathize how Frederick Douglass would have viewed it as absurd, ridiculous, positively sinful. We see even in entertainment, the skeleton key. One of my favorite lines in the movie, The Skeleton Key. Oh no, I don't believe in it, but I'm not gonna mess with it. And we still hear that commonly in New Orleans, in Louisiana, people who will profess to be Christian, church going, oh, we don't really believe in that stuff. Um, but at the same time, it is given its due perimeter of respect. And that could be attributed to an um, ancestral entanglement within the coding of our DNA, ancestral memory, particularly for those of you who claim no knowledge of the tradition, no exposure of the tradition. Yet, you know, you have some holiday activities that come straight from our practice and our tradition. What you're doing on the holidays, what you're doing on New Year's and New Year's Eve. What are you doing at that watch service? What are you doing, in that church service, on the fifth Sunday? And to what degree is that an amalgamation, a synchronizing of our traditions that we just would not let go of, could not have it beat out of us, could not have it driven far enough underground that it began to manifest itself in code within the church. And certainly the Black Spiritualist Church, Mama Catherine and many others, but even in the church, and certainly it's still present in, some would say even more so in the modern church, both here in the US and certainly in Nigeria, Ghana, Cameroon. See, I see you. I see beyond the veil. I hear your Christian talk, but I also see your voodoo practice. Though you masking it, you're coding it. And so these statements were guided in part by Frederick Douglass's, exposure to Christianity and how Christianity was talked about. How Christianity is talked about among the people that don't usually line up with, you academic biblical scholars out there who truly understand where the crux of this text is being derived from. And so, one of the key arguments used by abolitionists to undermine the legitimacy of slavery was that few slaves received true Christian instruction. They certainly believed that Christian instruction would drive out the devil, would drive out the adherence to these traditions, though they saw the demonstration of Cuba and subsequently Brazil and Puerto Rico and various other Catholic dominated locations, that this tradition not only survived, became much more regimented, much more organized, and subsequently much more coded in terms of its amalgamation into Christianity and Catholic symbolism. Uh, Many of the Islamic coding was present even before they arrived here, even before they left the shores of West Africa. The very word alafia in Yoruba has Arabic root. So this was tangibly measured by the persistence of so-called heathen or savage African religious practices in the plantation South. And certainly New Orleans became sort of the poster child for that, because it was the one place where we had a certain degree of freedom to dance, sing, drum, kalinda, sing, dance, drum, Congo, sing, dance, drum, Yambalu, in Congo Square, which then and now was a public space to some degree. So you're still seeing performance, African traditional system based performance, but you are rarely seeing authentic demonstration of ceremony, uh, for many of the same reasons: politics, socialization. What my mom and them gonna think if they found out that we're doing Ebo, in the middle of Congo Square, that sort of thing. And with it being city property, with it being public space, there's those state laws and those city laws and those, you know, type of things that we acknowledge, under this system. So the practices are still, in a great degree, underground or within the dynamics of the community. And we see a similar demonstration now, even in West Africa, where many are operating within the mainstream dominant religions, but are still ethnically, culturally, familiarly, family based connected to these systems, sometimes beyond their willingness to even discuss it publicly. So, despite Frederick Douglass' obvious disdain for conjure, he still wore the root, and it's now a part of Frederick Douglass's documented history. So, in August 1834, a confrontation Douglass had with Colby involved a protracted wrestling bout between the two that rendered the former Negro breaker as gentle as a lamb. And for the next 6 months that Douglass lived with him, Douglass lived relatively peacefully with this former master and overseer. And although Douglass never fully acknowledged the hoodoo, the root in his right pocket was certainly a factor in his new spirit of assertiveness and resistance. So, in another case, William Webb, a conjurer living in Kentucky, became concerned about the cruel treatment faced by slaves on a neighboring plantation. After secretly meeting with the slaves, Webb urged them to gather roots that were then placed in a bag. The slaves then walked around their own quarters a few times and positioned the bags in front of their master's abode during the morning hours. These steps were taken to induce their master to have dreams about the slaves, gaining retribution for past wrongs. Shortly after, the master reportedly began to treat the slaves decidedly better, and Webb's influence over the slaves was to increase dramatically as a result. Some even suggest that this was sort of the motivation behind, oh wow, I just drew a blank, the Black horror movie. It's told in I believe 3 parts, and they go and visit the mortuary in one scene, and in another scene, There's this painting on the wall with slaves on it that come to life. Somebody in the chat know what movie I'm talking about. But I believe they drew that inspiration from this true story. So in a case related to Henry Clay Bruce by a female slave from Amelia County, Virginia, a conjurer was said to have been employed to aid about 30 slaves who were fearing their imminent sale to the cotton fields of Alabama in the year 1800. And hearing of a conjurer living 10 miles away from the plantation, the slaves pooled their resources to pay him to set a hand or jack on the massa. After receiving $10 in payment, this conjurer went to the front door steps of the great house about 12 o'clock that night, dug a small hole under the ground step, took from his pocket a little ball, talked to it a while in a whisper, then kissed it and put it in the hole and covered it carefully and walked away. The key was ensuring that the master actually stepped over the hand. If that did not occur, then all the conjurer's preparations and incantations to make the charm effective would have been wasted effort. So fortunately for those slaves, the next morning they saw the master come down the steps and walk around a while, then go back over this particular step. It was thought that this ensured the success of the hand. In any case, the slaves were never sold to Alabama. Fugitive slave Henry Bibb related similar experiences. According to Bibb, the general prescription for dealing with an abusive master was some kind of bitter root, which the slave was directed to chew and spit in the direction of their master. Along with the root were certain kinds of powders to sprinkle about their master's dwellings. This is all done for the purpose of defending themselves in some peaceable manner. And we've heard throughout the decades, at least, well, if it's so much power in the voodoo, so much power in this, Aboriginal and indigenous practice, well, why didn't they use it? Well, I'm giving you the receipts. It absolutely was used and was documented successful on many occasions. But if the hunter is writing the story, why would they promote that? Why would they not, do what they've always done, which is to bastardize, demonize, and then when they can't do so, appropriate, commercialize the practice and the tradition, but keep you in limbo in terms of, what's real and what isn't. So after a conjurer gave Bibb the protective powders and roots, he did not receive a whipping for leaving the plantation without permission. Bibb firmly trusted in the powders conveyed to him, claiming that he had great faith in conjuration and witchcraft, which led him to believe that he could do what he pleased without getting flogged. Thus emboldened, he left the plantation again without his master's permission. On his return, Bibb's master punished him for absconding, but he added, "I did not believe that he could do it while I had the root and dust." We also know that the Bois came on in Haiti prior to the revolt involved root, powder, dust, paquet of some kind that was given to the Maroons that gave them this certain sense of empowerment, invulnerability that led to a successful Haitian revolution. Unfortunately for Bibb, however, his master was so enraged at his slave's saucy reports that he grasped a handful of switches and punished him severely in spite of all his roots and powders. And despite the seeming failure of the charms of protection, Bibb was to consult yet another conjurer who gave him a concoction composed of fresh cow manure, red pepper, and hair from a white man's head to safeguard Bibb from further abuse by his master. That Bibb was to continue believing in conjure even after evidence that protective charms did not work is indicative of how much sway this practice had in the slave community. And certainly a Christianized, religiousized slave community would have took note of, and I like the word saucy. We think that's a new, modern sort of reference to the behaviors of men. But I liked how they used the word saucy in particular. And so I could see Bibb, taking a degree of responsibility for uh, the root, the hand not working, for him just being arrogant and pressing, his luck. And we see that even in modern practice, with, the good luck and the financial rituals and I need my man back, against all odds. There's that ego that commonly comes into play. It's very common in an Odu Obara and in an Abla Odu. That ego and self sabotage can come into play with any religious, spiritual, magical healing tradition. So even the failure of the charms to protect slaves from their masters or from whites could be explained without disturbing the foundations and their belief in the Aboriginal practices. Henry Clay Bruce claimed that if a slave with a protective hand, or what they sometimes refer to as a jack, got whipped and so reported to the old conjurer, he would promptly claim one of three things: either that someone removed the jack, or that the fellow had failed to carry out instructions, or had no faith in the jack, and therefore was deserving of punishment. We see the same formula applied in religion, in church. Either someone, is not operating within the tradition, or they failed to carry out the instructions of the book or the pastor, or they had no faith in the pastor of the book, the spirit, and the tradition. It's a commonly used formula. And not only did conjurers claim to possess supernatural abilities and charms to protect fellow slaves, these spirituals were also able at times to avoid their own punishments from whites. Susan Snow, an ex slave from Wilcox County, Alabama, testified that her mother was a Black African who could not be whipped by her master. And she referred to her mother as a Black African, um, which is a trigger for me personally. One of the earliest stories that I can remember my own mother telling me, and some of you have seen my mother, you know what my mother looks like. Um, my mother was born in 1940 something. And during that time, one of the worst things that you could call a person was a Black African. Black was the worst thing. Remember now, this is before, I'm Black and I'm proud. This is before African American. This is before African. This is before we generally consume Pan Africanism. And so Black African was indeed one of the worst things that you could be called or referred to as. And it crystallized a capsule of other, negative connotations along with it. And so Snow, the ex former slave Snow, mother said a conjure and Dave was all scared of till the next day to get somebody to help tie her up. Then he forgot to whip her. They used to say she was a conjure and Dave was all scared of her. So, in plain English, a conjurer empowered her and she had the hand or the jack apparently somewhere on her and was tied up, and Master forgot to whip her. You know how some of your mamas and daddies, especially the X generation, Generation X, where corporal punishment was still a common, factor in many households. Just the fear of getting the whipping. When I get home, or at the end of the day, or when your daddy get home, or you go to your room and you wait till I get there, or even the act of going and, plucking the switch and the delayed repercussion of the action. So it was not totally uncommon for an overseer or master to, tie somebody up, maybe even get drunk, because they would often have to consume alcohol even to do such a thing. And with the aid of this trick, if you will, they believed that it prevented master from meting out any retribution. So this fear was perhaps associated with conjurers having command over both esoteric and mundane means of retribution. Their knowledge of roots and herbs gave them the uh, simultaneous ability to cure the ailing and to poison wrongdoers. And we've talked in previous shows about Mammy poisoning Massa and Massa kids and the lady of the house, in retributive acts. Many of their children um, did not survive in some cases because of this awareness of the usage of plants, herbs, roots to create both that to heal and that to poison. The skill in creating toxic substances made Gullah Jack Pritchard one of the key conspirators in the 1822 Denmark-Vesey conspiracy, a feared presence among the whites of Charleston, South Carolina. One of his contingency plans in case the retribution failed or was betrayed was so frightening that all mention of it was intentionally omitted from the version of the trial record made publicly available by judges Lionel Kennedy and Thomas Parker. Certainly, they did not want it repeated. And Henry Haig, one of the conspirators who turned state's witness, told the court that Jack was going to give me a bottle with poison to put into my master's pump and into as many pumps as he could about town. And he said he wanted to give the other bottles to those he could trust. And so the pump was probably the water pump to pollute the water in these communities. John Blassingame argued that conjurers were industrious enough to avoid punishment and in turn turned their slave comrades that they were not punished because they had cast a spell on their masters. So whether you believed in the magic or you believed in the cunningness of our intellect, we were cunning and successful nonetheless. And this was not always the case, however, in William Wells Brown's discussion of the conjurer named Dinky. Industriousness alone did not explain his uncanny ability to avoid punishment. In fact, Dinky was known to never work, but always also was never beaten, nor was he sold, and typically wearing a snake's skin around his neck, carrying a petrified frog in one pocket and a dried lizard in the other. Dinky was such a feared figure on the plantation that Brown claimed he was his own master. And not only were conjurers thought to be able to protect themselves and others from punishment at the hands of whites, it was also believed that they could foretell the outcome of rebellions and runaway attempts. This ability was said to have saved Philip, the blind preacher, from execution in the trials following the Denmark Vesey conspiracy. Philip predicted the disastrous outcome of the plot and discouraged slaves from continuing on in their ill-fated path. In similar fashion, Frederick Douglass received a warning from conjure man Sandy Jenkins, who informed Douglass about a series of visions he had had while slaves on the plantation were plotting a mass escape. Sandy's interpretation of the dreams did not bode well for the conspirators, and he told Frederick Douglass, "There is something in the dream. There is indeed honey." And despite these warnings, the slaves continued their plans. And on the morning of the escape, Douglass himself had a premonition. "I had a sudden presentiment presentiment which flashed upon me like lightning in a dark night. I instantly turned to Sandy Jenkins, who was near me, and said to him, 'Sandy, we are betrayed. Something just told me so.' Sandy replied to Douglass, 'Man, that is strange, but I feel just as you do.' Within minutes, the plan was revealed and the slaves were placed in custody. At times, the predictions of slave fortune tellers had positive outcomes. Uncle Frank of St. Louis, Missouri, described by William Wells Brown as a slave who was very distinguished, not only among the slave population, but also among the whites as a fortune teller, once predicted that Brown would successfully escape bondage. After being paid a fee of 25 cents, Uncle Frank gazed into a gourd filled with water and immediately relayed the results. Brown would later query whether the old man was a prophet or the son of a prophet. "I cannot say, but there is one thing certain: many of his predictions were verified." So this was certainly common knowledge, but not something that they wanted the slave populace to believe, and to certainly believe enough to uh, pass it along. The fear of the knowledge of these practices were enough to keep many, until this day, out of balance, out of touch with their own innate, inherent, natural spiritual gifts and abilities. And certainly psychology, psychiatry, and Western education, has sort of demonized or bastardized at the minimum dreams, premonitions, visions, as figments of our imagination. And certainly you mix, a good dose of, societal crazy and certainly mental health into the equation, then what you're able to see, tap, envision, and comprehend can swing greatly in one direction or the other. In a more famous case, Harriet Tubman had frequent premonitions and visions while helping slaves escape from bondage. Sarah Bradford, Tubman's biographer, remarked that she is the most shrewd and practical person in the world. Yet she is a firm believer in omens, dreams, and warnings. Harriet Tubman reportedly had dreams that foretold her flight from bondage, helped her avoid pursuers during her missions in the South, and predicted the Civil War and the eventual emancipation of all slaves 3 years before these events actually occurred. And according to Harriet Tubman, her father was the source of these abilities because he had an uncanny skill of predicting the weather and even foretold the Mexican American War. We also understand that Harriet Tubman was said to have oh, I just drew a blank. The health condition that narcolepsy, the health condition that causes you to fall asleep um, spontaneously, in mid conversation. You could be sitting in a group watching TV, and and they just kind of nod out. And so Harriet Tubman was said to also have narcolepsy, And so I believe that in many so-called disabilities, mental health conditions, there is a spiritual component. And when we grew up in environments that don't allow for space for treating, educating, you know, mentoring those skills and abilities, they can then develop mental health conditions. They can then mask as mental health conditions. And once you stop believing yourself, then you begin to believe you are crazy. Thank you, Teresa Callahan. I appreciate that. My new mic is working on Blog Talk Radio. I appreciate that. Thank you. Greetings, Sitio Dreams. Greetings, Chito Pa. Greetings, beloved. Empress Imani. Greetings, Alexis Williams, Craig Burns, the Goddess Initiative. Thank you all for your consistent support, listenership, and participation. I believe that the narcolepsy and those infrequent, spells, as they would have called it back then, somehow aided in Harriet Tubman's ability to tap these alternate dimensional spaces, these alternate frequencies that string theory suggests that we exist within. I believe that autism and Asperger's syndrome and being on the spectrum greatly helps me in my gift and why my ratings are as high as they are. I don't have the same filters as you do. I don't have the same gates to pass through as you do. Often emotionally, I've learned to develop them verbally. I can often control what I say, but I cannot often control how I feel or what I see or what I sense. So a symptom of that is, it shows up in my face. Some of you under the sound of my voice have been told you can't hide anything in your face. Now, if I'm performing, if I'm acting, I can act and I can perform. But if I'm in my natural state, um, I often cannot mask in my face and in my body language my response to things. As a reader, and I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm gonna say it anyway. Probably the worst time to catch me is after I've been up all night and I haven't had hardly any sleep or barely any sleep, and then you want a reading at 6, 7, 8 in the morning. I'm going to be so unfiltered, even with my mother and my sister Wapani and my sister Kim and Rochelle and Larry and Tessie and the people that I communicate with every morning, the good morning greetings. We do that by text. I rarely do audio recordings. I rarely do, the short video until I am ready, until I have my face on, if you will. I have to have my drag on before before I, open the door, open the window to the world because I am not because I'm ugly. I wake up authentic.
90 seconds.
I wake up honest and I wake up most true to myself. And like children, as we get older, as the day matures, we learn to mask how we feel. We learn to mask what we say. We learn to mask the intra-dimensional communications that we're having consistently and constantly with God, the goddess,
60
the
seconds.
ancestors, and indeed the spirit realm. So I appreciate you. I love you. Thank you for supporting me for another live revolutionary Hoodoo New Orleans Voodoo Secrets and Recipes. We shall meet again in this shared sacred space at high noon U.S. Central Standard Time on tomorrow. My live listen in and call in number is area code 563-999-3763. 563-999-3763. You're always available to use the chat in both Blog Talk Radio, as well as social media, wherever you are. But if you wish to
10 seconds.
join me live on screen with your webcam, just follow the StreamYard link for the upcoming broadcast, and I will be more than happy to bring you in. Thank you kindly. Peace and love, much joy and prosperity. One of you, your breakthrough is coming today. Today. All is a blessing. Ashe, Asheo, and Ashe. Kalamuya Salam.
Square.
Kalamuya Salam, Congo Square.
The Almost Indians prepared this place for us centuries before our arrival. A sacred spot where corn festivals were celebrated. The Almost Indians prepared this place for us centuries before our arrival. Congo Square, a sacred spot where corn festivals were celebrated. And as the colonizers came, our hosts, the Almost Indians, they pushed aside our hosts. The colonizers came and pushed aside our hosts and introduced us in chains. And by the late 1700s, we somehow, recognizing the sacredness of Les Places, we somehow, and the how of our somehow persuasive methodologies is not clear at this moment. The how is not clear. How our persuasive methodologies work is not clear at this moment, but nevertheless, even as slaves, we crafted and created a space where we could be free to be we. And thusly we countered the sacrilegiousness of the French, giving great homage to our ancestors as well as giving praise and thanks to our red-blooded brothers and sisters. This is an oral libation toast to Congo Square, to Native Americans, to our ancestors who made a circle out of a square and gave us a way to save ourselves from the transformatory ugliness of America, which refuses to recognize the spirituality of life, which refuses to recognize the spirituality of life and celebrates death with crosses, double and triple crosses, the middle passage, the first cross, Christianity, the double cross, and capitalism, the ultimate triple coup de grace cross of our captivity. But the terror of crosses notwithstanding, we stand. We was and is. Hail Congo Square. Congo Square. Our African gods have not been obliterated. They have merely retreated inside the beat of us. Inside the beat of us, our African gods have not been obliterated. They have merely retreated inside the beat of us until we are ready to release them into a world that we recreate. A world held by the beating of black heart drums. Heartbeat. At this place circle ourselves into community. No beginning, no end, connected together and singing, ringing, singing in a ring. Second, let's be original, aboriginal. Be what we were before we became what we are. Be bambula dance, be banza music, and sing song words which have no English translation. Third, let us remember. Let us remember never to forget, even when we can't remember the specifics, we must retain the essential. Let us remember never to forget, even when we can't remember the specifics, we must retain the essentials. The bounce, the blood, flow, the feel, the spirit, grow, energy, must retain and pass on the essential usness that others want to dissipate out of us. But no matter how much of us they prohibit, no matter how much of us they prohibit, deep inside us is us. Deep inside us is us. Remains us inside and needs only the beat to set us free. The beat to free us. It is morning. A Sunday. A field. A field without shade, but dark. Dark with the people black of us in various shades, eclipsing the sun with our elegance. We are centuries later now, and still this sacred ground calls us to remember, to be. We are centuries later now, and still this sacred ground calls us to remember, to be, beat, combo square. B, Congo square. B, 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 B. Congo square. B, Congo square. B, 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 B.
Thank you for using Blog Talk Radio. Goodbye.